Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ancient Warfare Podcast. This is very odd because normally when I say that, I follow it up with Ancient Warfare Answers. No, this is the big full panel of the Ancient Warfare Podcast without Jasper. So Murray is in the hot seat and hosting today, but I am joined, other than without Jasper, by the usual crew of Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and Mark McCaffrey. And today is what we call an in-betweener. So last time we discussed the last issue of the magazine, and next time we will discuss the next issue of the magazine. So we are in between, hence in-betweener. And this time we're going to tackle a very thorny question, which is, being all fancy, what they call diachronic, meaning it covers time periods and cultures. And we're going to look at the evolution of tactics, which in many ways is probably far too much to bite off than we can chew in a single session. Off camera, for instance, we were already debating what is the difference between tactics and strategy and stratagems, which is a debate in itself, which we'll put that aside for another in-betweener. So, the evolution of tactics, where do you start? Where do you stop? What leads to such evolutions? Is it evolutionary, or is it, we've discussed revolutionary things before, all sorts of things like that. So that's it. We've only got one question, which we'll probably get to a little bit later in our discussion. But who would like to kick us off with the evolution of tactics? Where do we want to start? Do we want to start Bronze Age, pre-Bronze Age, Neolithic?
I'm going to just throw this to create ripples in the pond of intellectual discussion. Effectively the first humanoid who picks up a stick and hits somebody else with it provokes a counter response, probably with a bigger stick. Hence, we have an evolution of tactics, and it just scales from there.
Me and a friend are going to come and beat you up because you beat me up. There you go. There's a.
But then two men have to work out how they're going to work together, right, in order to be able to do what they want to do. And I think it's when you start bringing multiple force to a conflict situation, you need probably to coordinate it in order to be able to efficiently use the force, minimize the casualties, and achieve the set objective. So I suddenly went and put lots of ripples in that pool for you to discuss. I
don't think you're wrong. And I think the interesting thing about that is you then to start looking at, oh, well, hang on, you're better at taking blows than I am. I'm quick and nimble. So why don't you stand there in the middle and, take the hits from the guy that we're beating up? Sounds like we're sort of strategizing the pub fight on Friday night. And then, I'll run around the sides and I'll get in with some quick blows while he can't, And that idea that you then get tactical evolution because you've got different types of troop, different types of skill sets. But based on your environment, probably you have different skill sets in terms of what you're good at doing, whether it be running, riding, hunting, all of those sorts of things. And then, of course, you've got class systems within a society that are better at or have the leisure to pursue such things and the wealth to pursue such things.
You're very well read on all those tactical manuals and all the historical sources generally. Are there any ancient historians or strategists who actually contemplate where it came from?
Homer. It's always from Homer.
That was what I was going to go to, actually, in terms of everybody goes back to Homer is this crucial text that everybody venerates and thinks is wonderful. And it can't be helped if everybody's thinking that about these lovely poems, but at the same time, it's harking back to the days of yore when, great, whatever, were doing this in warfare. But actually, through the haze of it all, ironically, it comes back to what Murray said in terms of the guy standing in the middle with the big shield, protecting the little guy who's going to run out and actually have a go at somebody. And of course, there's lots of debate over what were the tactics, for example, in Mycenaean Greece. Are they reflected in things like the Iliad? Book 8 of the Iliad has a great scene where Telamonian Aias is standing there with his great tower shield and defending whilst his brother is running out every now and then from behind the shield to have a pot shot at somebody with his arrows and then running back for shelter. And this idea of a smaller, more mobile troop running out from a defender position, which is, it doesn't necessarily have to be, I think some people have sort of said, this is where the hoplites and their phalanx begin, etc. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It might be more like a nebula formation roaming around the battlefield, which actually gels a little bit better with Homer. But of course, all this is sort of feeding into the later archaic Greek armies and their ethos and inspiring them and probably going into some of their tactics.
And there was the dichotomy between the heavy armored hoplite and the light armored or unarmored peltast who would throw arrows, whereas the hoplite was the fighter that would stay and take the blows, whereas the peltast would hit an enemy from a distance. And we see at Sphacteria that the Spartan hoplites just couldn't catch the peltasts that the enemy had brought to bear on them and were defeated by light troops. So we see that, and in some sense, that's tactics right there, because you have a different troop type defeating a missile troop, defeating a heavy armored troop. They're both meant to do different things, but didn't necessarily. One would have an advantage depending on where and when they met. Close up, the heavy infantry would always win, but if there was enough room to run away, the light troops would retreat, then come back again for more.
So at what point does a tactic, which I'm thinking of is a way of fighting in the here and now to gain an advantage over your opponent, like kill him, defeat him, whatever, become a combat doctrine, a sort of whole set of methodologies in which you tackle? Because you mentioned things like phalanxes and things. They sound like that's not tactics so much as a whole combat doctrine.
Oh, I don't know. So combat doctrine's a really peculiar one, and none of the ancient authors talk about things in that way. They don't talk about combined arms. People love bringing up who was the first ancient general to use combined arms. Once upon a time it was Alexander, and then it's got pushed back and back and back and back. And I believe it's now somewhere back in the 5th century BC where the first combined arms, I think it might be Delium in 424 BC. It might not be. I'm not saying that is. I'm not trying to be controversial. I think the funny thing is that it's tied up culturally. And the fact I was going to say about Mark's point about Homer, Vegetius uses Homer to justify what he's saying about the Roman legion. But he's looking at the antique Roman legion in the 4th century or 5th century AD. Ammianus uses Homer to justify what he's saying. Polybius uses Homer to describe the Macedonian and Hellenistic phalanx, because Homer says, shield pressed on shield, buckler pressed on buckler, because the men were so close together, which is very vague. It's our pub fight. If there's 2 of you against 3 of them, yes, your shields pressed together. Well, you've had to pick up a shield first. Oh,
it's more than that. It's helmet against helmet, crest against crest.
Yes. So all of that Homeric poetry leads into people being able to use it to justify their view of history throughout the ancient world for 1,500 years or more. So that's tricky because it becomes culturally a touchstone in terms of, Homer said it, so it must be right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when your ruling class becomes, whether it be your chariot driver, your charioteer, not your chariot driver, your guy who stands in chariot firing arrows or javelins while someone else drives for them, or your warrior who stands there like a shield and heavy armor, stands there like a tower with heavy armor and a tower shield, or the promachos, the forward fighter, the fighter who's so good that they fight in front of the line. All of those things are tactical, and even the Telamonian Ias example is tactical, but it becomes cultural in the sense that that's what a leader does. That's what a warrior leader does.
It's interesting you say cultural, though, because it's a matter of keeping up with the Joneses, basically, even at that stage, because the Eastern Mediterranean is so connected at that stage that actually they are adopting tactics that are used across the Mediterranean, from the Babylonians to the New Kingdom Egyptians to the Hittites. And you mentioned the chariots, of course. Mycenaean Greece is the last place you really want to drive around a chariot. But on the other hand, it's what all the other big boys are doing. So therefore, the Mycenaean Greeks had better get in on the action and do this style of, use these tactics that everybody else is using, whether it's military advantageous or it's just, again, cultural, adoption of cultural practices.
Well, I think it's again the idea that these cultures are actually far more interconnected than we generally acknowledge because of that the Joneses over in Lydia influence us in Greece. It's that interesting point where, well, I'm not going to do it that way. I'll do it a different way. Is a moment of revolution or a moment of tactical thinking or strategic thinking even. Of, well, let's not do that. Let's do this. And we see the same thing. And, well, why does Greece have hoplites? If there is one region where you think a heavy plane-based infantry tactic shouldn't evolve, it's Greece, and yet that's where it comes from. So you're like, well, and again, controversy. Does it? Don't they borrow it from? Well, they maybe do, but they're certainly the example that we hold up today of where heavy infantry, flat plane, level playing field warfare comes from, and it's one of the least appropriate geographical regions to do that in. But that, again, every city-state says, well, that's what we're going to do, until someone says, well, hang on a minute, why don't we concentrate on this style of warfare, which we're better at? And again, those sorts of moments of tactical shifts in thinking. And I think that's, again, one of the things that when we look at innovators in terms of tactics and evolution of tactics, they often think in that terms. They think outside the box. They're not going to just do what everyone's done better. And that's a fascinating thing in terms of, I won't do this thing that has been done for generations. I'm supposed to strive to be a better hoplite, or strive to be a better warrior, or a better charioteer, and you do see across the ancient world at various points in time in various cultures arms races for more of a certain thing, but you also see innovations there where, the shifting of the axle, for instance, between a Hittite chariot and an Egyptian chariot probably wasn't thought of, getting back to Lindsay's point, probably wasn't thought of in terms of doctrine. It was a far more practical, the shifting axle of a chariot, for instance, you couldn't really say, or the adoption of cavalry. Was it a combat doctrine, or was it oh yeah, we could use horses for that? Great, excellent plan, and then suddenly cavalry become, from 8th century BC onwards, cavalry become a much more important arm.
And to that point, I'm just wanting to get Mark's idea of the cultural. I think, from what little I know of the societies beyond Greece and Rome, is that some have a natural bias towards using cavalry and therefore mounted soldiers or warriors, as opposed to other ones where they're more infantry based. And when you put those two together, and I'll always remember there's, I think, Dan Snow, when he's recreating the Battle of Waterloo or something, and he stands while these, the Royal Horse Guards charge at him. And he says it's terrifying because you've got literally the noise and the physical vibration of the ground as all these horse come. It's a real test of one's mettle, mettle, in being able to withstand that sort of shock. So you can imagine having a response to that gets people to, in your way of looking at it, Mary, someone says, we can't keep doing what we used to do because that's how they fight. We don't fight like that. We have to have a response.
But it's interesting in, both Greek and Italian peninsular warfare, that idea of, and some of these are myths, the idea that Greek cavalry's poor until the Macedonians. They're a good Greek cavalry. The Thessalians, gosh, that's a tongue twister, have always had good cavalry. It's just that the warfare of Greece hasn't valued that arm, except in very rare circumstances of pursuing broken enemy, for instance. Cavalry come into their own then. But they sit around waiting for that. And again, I think one of the problems we've got is this is what cavalry do. They charge. And when we look at battles like Marathon, where are the cavalry? They're not even in the account of Herodotus, but surely they're there. And they were on the painted stoa. The stoa poikile shows cavalry. So where are the cavalry?
Or indeed, if you go further west to the Iberian Peninsula, when you've got the Cantabrian horsemen who literally have a maneuver where they circle around and they dispense with their weapon and then they vanish off the battlefield. So I'm wondering where that comes down. So there's landscape which plays a role in all of this. Then there's the value people place on the actual military assets, here horses or men. But I think in, let's say, in the Celtiberian, there's a greater respect for the horse anyway. So they look at it, they bring that to the battlefield as a matter of honor, but also as like the tank, you know.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the steppe peoples, they wouldn't think tactically without thinking of the horse. In fact, the horse is omnipresent. It's in everything. It's in all their decorations. It's in all their jewelry. So the horse is integral to what they do. So I think yes, absolutely. And you bandy terms around like culture and what is culture, and like Mark was saying, is it keeping up with the Joneses? Well, yes, that's cultural too. It's funny because we tend to not look at continuity as a cultural thing. We look at change because it's a moment where you can go, oh, things differ. Why? How? Who? As opposed to yes, but there's 800 years of continuity before that. Why? How? Who? And that's much more boring.
It's a political tool as well. If you look at somebody like Philip II, and in terms of shifting the power of Macedon and actually establishing themselves as that real authority within the Greek peninsula, and the fact that he is putting his foot down as a ruler of Macedon, he's got to show that he is going to be different, and his way of doing it is actually bringing in a revolution of tactics.
I think there are several moments, and I agree. What else have we got to lose? And I think the fact is that when you look at a lot of tactical innovation moments, they are what have we got to lose? They generally follow on a horrendous defeat, not in modern terms where their society is destroyed and their culture overtaken, because that isn't generally the way of ancient warfare. But if you look at the tactics of the Thebans under Epaminondas, they've been under the thumb of Sparta in the 380s, and then they have a revolution. Whether this tactical innovation comes before the revolution or after, it's still a debated point. But they soon go, right, we're going to do things differently. And then you've got the same thing with Philip. I think you've got the same thing with the so-called Camillan reforms in the Roman army. They've just lost the Battle of the Allia in 390 or 387, depending on which chronology you use. That's the perfect point to go, right, well, what we were doing with the Roman legion didn't work. Let's try something new. And again, we like giving things to a single person, the Marian reforms, the Camillan reforms, Philip II. And others have argued it's a longer process. It's a procedural change, which is interesting in terms of what you were talking about, Lindsay, is combat doctrine, is procedures. And we tend not to look at ancient warfare in those terms. We tend to look at individuals who are responsible. And then once that individual has been given credit for completely revolutionizing the tactics of a culture, then starts well, hang on, this was before him, this was after him. Actually, the only evidence for that is 40 years later. And so they start to erode the responsibility of that individual. But the funny thing, again, with what we're talking about is that there will always be people coming back saying, oh, no, it really is Marius who's responsible for these reforms. Oh, no, it really is Camillus who's responsible for these reforms. It really is Epaminondas. It really is Philip. And so that you end up in that never-ending argument triangle where someone says, no, here are my reasons. Someone then rebuts those reasons and says, here are my reasons why. But generally speaking, the reason why is because it's the cultural norm. To turn around and say it's not Philip II, there will always be someone who comes back and says, but it's the accepted position that it is Philip II, therefore it's Philip II. And they will destroy your arguments. And we get the same in modern scholarship. Disagreeing with Ronald Syme or Theodore Mommsen or other great academics is very hard to do because someone will just come up with, oh, well, Syme says, and you're like, why are we, and that's a problem I think any young researcher has. They'll have an insight which disagrees with a major academic position on a particular topic, but they've not only got to shift everyone else's opinion on that topic too, they've got this weight of history to try and overcome that some people will dismiss immediately without even a second glance.
If I could advance one example of a cultural shift that led to a new tactic, it would have been Epaminondas's weighting of the Theban phalanx at Leuctra to that, as I recall, it's a 50 man deep left wing. And now normally the position of honor was on the right wing of each Greek phalanx, which meant that the stronger troops of each army faced generally the weaker troops of the opposing phalanx, whereas Epaminondas decided to match strength against strength, and at Leuctra it was the Spartans on the facing the giant phalanx, and he refused his own right wing so that it never even came into contact, won the battle. So right there, he made a choice to go against convention. With the so-called Camillian reforms, I can see how that was instead, with the Romans having been defeated at the Allia, the old-style Greek phalanx, which presumably the Romans were fighting at the Allia, let's just take that as accepted for now, that is turning into the three lines, okay, the triplex aces, where you had a built-in reserve. That is, if one line was overwhelmed, there was still a line behind that and a line behind that. I can see how maybe that would have been a reasonable, sensible decision after such a mauling that they took. I mean, can you ascribe it to one person named Camillus? Who knows? But it does seem that is a very a wise course to have a second and third lines just in case your first line is overwhelmed. Because the old style Greek phalanx, the problem was that if it was broken apart, there was no reserve left, and whereas the Romans had a built-in reserve. So
I think the old-fashioned tactic is be better. Be better at being a phalangite. Be better in the phalanx. Don't run. Don't turn and flee. And the other thing, of course, with Xenophon's problematic for the Leuctra because he doesn't mention the echelon as a deliberate tactic. He mentions that the less reliable troops are kept away, which is not, it's kind of a negative way of saying what I think Epaminondas does, and we can use Diodorus and Pausanias especially to say, well, actually, this seems to be a deliberate tactic. And then to be the devil's advocate, there are other arguments, of course, that depths of phalanx lines have been deepening. We've got 25 at Delium, and you've got various battles where the depth of Athenian and other lines seem to be 20. So the traditional depth of 8 or 10 or 12 is slowly getting deeper. And then you get Leuctra with 50, and then same at Mantinea, although no one at Mantinea mentions a depth, but he does the same thing with a packed left wing and an echelon formation, which again targets the Spartans. So it's a fascinating thing, and I think there is also a trend in that idea of evolution of tactics ascribed to individuals to erode the heroic individual who's normally given that credit and take credit away from them. And so part of the let's not credit Epaminondas, let's not credit Philip II, let's not credit Marius is not just about, but we can see a process forming here. It's about pulling down that heroic figure for no other reason that they've got a target on their back because they're the heroic figure. People love to do that. I mean, I suggested in an earlier podcast that we had where Marcus Rutilius Rufus is possibly responsible for some of Marius's reforms, and people are like, who? And you're like, well, this guy, the consul of 105. Oh, if you're a great figure from Roman history, with the Odyssey coming out very soon, you're in the afterlife and you're looking on human history, completely ignoring your contribution to Greek or Roman warfare, where you were the one responsible for a set of reforms that got, scholarship thereafter has credited to someone else. No, it was me. And they're waiting on some, academic 2,000 years later to go, it was him. Yay. Yes. Anyway.
But a lot of history is like that, aren't there? There are people claim other people's inventions or all sorts of things.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, part of the joy of academic study is when you come across something like that. And then, as I said before, you have the problem that you're putting forward this individual no one's ever heard of. And people just go, no, because Syme didn't say so. Mommsen didn't say so. Other historians. I haven't got a thing on my shoulder about Syme or Mommsen, but I don't want to name names for other academics. But there are many, many, many of them. And those of us who've contributed academic articles whose anonymous readers have given away their identity, which essentially their main argument for your article being rejected is he disagrees with me, therefore don't publish him. And you're like, oh well, that's rude. And a modern academic who wants their students to challenge them and loves it when their students come up with errors they've made is very rare. I believe Snodgrass was one. He would love his students to point out his errors and argue against him, and he would reward it and thrive on it, as opposed to how dare you attack me in my ivory curule chair, you pleb. Sorry, just to use some terms from Roman history. So and we still use those terms. We will talk about a pleb when they're lesser than us, when they're below us, not politically, not culturally, but knowledge-based or unintelligent-based, that's still a hark back to a Roman attitude.
I'll just simply mention that Marcus Agrippa was quite possibly a pleb. Very likely. But no, I think you raise interesting points, and of course, I think the other thing, bearing in mind, we're talking about the evolution of tactics. We now have a whole discipline of military studies which examines all of these in the minutest detail, because there's an industry behind it. They're trying to optimize success and sell equipment and stuff, and there's foreign policy impacts for having the wrong combinations of these things as well.
Well, we're living in a world where we're seeing in real time tactics evolve with the evolution over the last 5 years of drone warfare, which really didn't exist prior to that. And I don't think anyone who was anticipating what drone warfare could be like anticipated what drone warfare is like and may become. And similarly, other tactics of what's going on and not working anymore. And so the need for evolution and what that will become. And I wonder whether, not that they had podcasts, but the five of us sitting around the Agora discussing in like a platonic dialogue, well, that didn't work. What can we do differently next time? Or, whether the Sphacteria battle and I was going to mention, again, when Mark DeSantis was talking about Peltas, and of course you've got Peltas, but then below Peltas, you've got Psiloi. Those blokes who just pick up anything and throw a rock, and so the hoplite looks down on the Peltas looks down on the Psiloi probably looks down on the rower, and then the rower points out, well, actually, I'm you if I pick up a rock. And then in the Roman terms, yes, you then get the triple aces, but you also have the Rurari and the Akensi, who never get mentioned, but they're in there. They're the number 4 and 5, normally standing in the third line with the Triari, but they don't get their own standard. They don't get their own, you're like, to the point that we only talk about the triple aces. We don't talk about, well, what happened to the 4th and 5th line? They don't get mentioned in battle counts except very, very rarely. It's a very tricky problem. No, I'm now lost that was my digression. What was I talking about before that?
Earliest Legion is very murky to try to tease out where it all came from. We're on much solider ground when we move on towards, say, the Polybian Legion, which wherever you want to say that starts, but it does seem to be that the Romans evolved a system in which you could actually move smaller subunits in an articulated army to allow troops to retire through the lines, bring up fresh troops that were not involved in the battle, but were close enough to plug gaps, allow the other units that may have been worn down to get back. And also the Roman tactics were equipment related. That is, they didn't give up missile weapons entirely. What they did was they incorporated this pilum as something to throw, giving it to the heavy armored legionary. Now in the earliest days, or the Polybian Legion, not every legionary would have been heavily armored, but they did have a big shield. They did have the pilum to throw. They could fight with some form of sword. Wouldn't necessarily have been the Gladius Hispaniensis yet, but they could actually engage in close combat. Moving along, probably the maniple was seen to be too small to deal with all combat situations, and that's why they then developed into the cohortal legion, where you had bigger units of cohorts actually forming the line. Once again, how did the Roman legion fight in the up close and personal form? Difficult to say, but it does seem to be that they never quite gave up on the idea of having some sort of reserve in terms of one line after another, so that if one line faltered, there's always someone behind them to absorb the shock of the next blow. It wouldn't just crack right there.
Yeah, replenishing the line, of course, is one of those. How did they? We get told they did, but then we can't work out how they did, and the gaps in the line and all this sort of stuff.
And I wish reenactors would address that. Exactly. That's one of the things that reenactors could really throw some insight to.
I think the other thing, of course, is those terms are always problematic because the word cohort is early. The word phalanx is early. Homer uses the word phalanx, but it doesn't mean what phalanx means for a hoplite, nor indeed what it means for a phalangite, but they all use the word phalanx. And similarly, legion means different things at different points in time in Roman history. And so, as does lokos, as does cohort, as does maniple. And so the problem, I think, is that very often our use those terms as if we should know what they mean and their minutiae. And again, when you're looking at Herodotus or Xenophon or Thucydides, of course, they're talking to the audience who do know what they mean.
Yeah, but I think they're also doing a little bit of the, generalization about certain, just throwing terms out there. Like, for example, if you start looking through when there's reference to a sword, a gladius for a Roman literally means, and later it sort of turns to the spatha, being just... It might get written a source as gladius, it might get written as spatha, but half the time they're just meaning a sword. It doesn't necessarily have to be that specific, type. Likewise with whether they're saying pilum, whether they're saying tellum,
verutum,
etc. So if they're throwing
the
out
aculum,
phalanx, who knows
Spiculum.
what they're actually referring to? They might just, It's like the Persians, of course. Every time the Persians go into talk about a fleet going out, it's always 600 ships. And it's like, do you mean that 600 is just a really big number for you guys? And you're just going to say it was 600 ships or so again. But it's just one of those common vernacular that
I love that myriad is a number as opposed to a myriad. It's like, well, is it? Well, there's myriads. There's myriads and myriads of men, and a myriad is 10,000, I think. I can't remember.
The better one is plethrum, because, of course, everybody uses that as a number. And, of course, you go back to the Persians and say, hold on, wasn't that a distance? Oh, sorry, whoops. But anyway, sorry, we digress.
Yeah, absolutely. Segues perfectly into our question. One question from Carlos. What would you say was the main tactical difference between the ancient Western world, aka Romans and Greeks, versus the tactics used in the East by the Armenians, Parthians, Sassanids, Judeans, etc.? Let's throw in Egyptians, Hittites, and others. So, of course, some of those never fought one another, but that's okay.
Well, I'm going to start with this answer. Judeans. I think to the Romans, Judeans means specifically people from what is basically that part of Israel now, right in the middle. And what I would suggest is we talked earlier about stone throwers. Slings are very, very much part of the tactical armory of Judean. I don't say Jewish, I say Judean, as opposed to all the other people who might be in that region. Warriors, and in fact, you see this used very effectively during the two Jewish wars, especially during the Bar Kokhba War of 132 to 135-6. And they combine that very effectively with skirmishing and, in fact, building tunnels underground from which they emerge to ambush their enemy. And this is not how Romans fight. So that's a major, major difference.
I would say that for the Greeks and the Romans, it was their adoption of a real heavy infantry type as their main soldier, their main fighter. Once again, I don't think it was necessarily a doctrine. It was just that was how they fought. Because you can have a heavy infantryman who does not wear armor, doesn't wear heavy armor, fights in a shield and with a shield relatively close to one another as heavy infantry. But over time, they quickly adopted heavier armor big shields, either spears or swords, that nature. With regard to the Sassanids, the Parthians, and the Armenians, I think the difference would have been that their armies would have been primarily, not exclusively, but primarily cavalry based, with relying on heavy armored cavalry and horse archers. That's, I would say, the primary difference. Now, there were infantry in those, the Armenian, Parthian, and Sasanian armies, just as there were cavalry in the Roman and Greek armies. But I'm talking about the balance or proportion. That is, if you were on the field and you were looking at the army, where was your main striking power coming from? Who was going to anchor that force? Infantry among the Greeks and Romans, and horsemen with the Armenians, the Parthians, and the Sasanians. Now, when you come to, say, the Macedonian army of Alexander, I won't use the term combined arms, all right, but but certainly they had top-notch heavy infantry combined with fantastic cavalry. So right there, that is, they had a lot. They're going, and Alexander used his cavalry, arguably speaking, as to maybe the main striking force of his army, and to deliver a knockout blow.
I'm still going to go with the subscription to Keeping Up with the Joneses. I mean, if you look at the Persians and the Medes early on, they developed tactics where they are heavily reliant on their archers. Their armor is, they're using wicker shields. They're not using huge amounts of body armor because they don't need that in terms of the style of fighting that they're doing. And all of those tactics are based on who they are fighting, that they are fighting each other in a particular area, at a particular time. And then, of course, when, for example, the Persians come into contact with the Greeks, you have a reaction by the Persians to develop their kardakes and develop them more along the lines of, well, they're going to have to be prepared to fight the heavy infantry from now on, like the phalanx of the Greeks. So therefore, we've got to change our tactics. And again, the Romans do the same thing later on when they come into the east and they're now fighting against mobile cavalry units. They again adapt, and their tactics change. So I think it's all about who are you fighting, or who are you in contact with at any given time, and that's the trend that you're following.
I agree. By the time of the late Roman Empire, the Romans had incorporated all sorts of horse archer units and also heavy armored cavalry, such as not getting into definitions, but they were either called cataphracts or klebenarii, depending on whether they were wearing, a soldier on a horse wearing a coat of mail, or a soldier on a horse wearing a coat of armor and armor for the horse. Those were mainly stationed in the east, so we can presume that those were meant to fight their opposite numbers, in the Persian army. So definitely, I think that the Romans had to adapt if they were going to keep up.
I think poetically, when you look at what, Aeschylus, for instance, is the first one to say that the East is represented by the arrow and the West by the spear. And then that continues. Aristotle reinforces it. You find it in the later Roman Empire, where it's the pila represents the Roman, and the arrow, the sagitta, represents the East, which again is odd and a cultural sort of poetic picture, because every Greek warrior had a sword of some kind. Every Persian warrior, for instance, had a spear. Not just a bow. They also had a sword, but it was shorter, generally speaking, than the Greek sword. Although Greek swords were exceptionally short. There's a I can't remember who it is, which was I think it's a Spartan king, which is my sword's too short. If you're complaining, then add a step to it. So short swords, longer swords exist across all cultures. Archers exist across all cultures, although, as we know from Greek warfare, they tend to disparage the archer. But so does Homer, and yet in Homer you've got two amazing archers in Tydeus and Odysseus, who exist in a world for Homer where he's pouring scorn on archers, and Paris as well, of course, being an archer. hitting a heel in the middle of battle is quite tricky. So there's that, and then at the same time you've got Romans all had a sword, whether it be a gladius or an ensis or a spatha. But the idea that the pila is the one thing that represents them, and I think we've talked about that in terms of tombstones, that actually the unifying element of a Roman legionary tombstone is, yes, sometimes they have a pila, yes, sometimes they have a hasta, yes, sometimes they have a sword, but they generally always have their belt. And so, if we were going to be real about it, the thing that represents a Roman soldier is their caningulum, which doesn't quite gel poetically. My belt against your sword, you're going to lose. So it's interesting that cultural perception of what represents us, and even in the framing of the question, West versus East is something that the ancients adopt. That Greek versus.
And yet the irony is that in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, it was North and South, which was actually the deciding factor, you might argue.
Well, and I mean, the other thing, of course, if you're in the Italian peninsula, Eastern warfare includes Greece.
And there's also the aspect of you've gone through all the different weapons of the Roman legionary typically, but in terms of the Pugio, that's an interesting one because it really, when you start looking into it, it only seems to be the equipment of any soldiers from Rome who have served in the West. It rarely actually appears on the equipment or in graves, etc., in the Eastern Empire, and it's a real. It's not something that comes across in any of the sources, etc. It's just the archaeology that seems to be showing us this. But seems to be a defining thing that I've served in the West. I've got a Pugio.
Archaeologically, with what Lindsay was saying about slingers, but all armies have slingers. Vegetius says that legionaries should be trained in slingmanship. Slingmanship, there you go, there's a word. So slingers are actually always there, and we know about the Balearic Island slingers and things like that, and that they're there, and the Rhodian slingers of Xenophon. But slingers seem to be present but unmentioned across a vast span of time. Archers are there, and even when they're disparaged, they're still included. They can't have been so disparaged that the archers of the Athenian army are such a huge corps, and then of course they have horse archers. Every ship has to have archers. I think the Athenians have 10, or is it 14? Oh. So they're seen as essential, even if we don't like them much. Much like the Psiloi and Peltas forces, that they're essential elements, but they're not the element that you emphasize, which is why in so many battle accounts we don't get the auxilia mentioned until we do. And then suddenly the auxiliary mentioned it. If you're at Mons Graupius, you're like, well, the auxiliary did all the fighting. They did the legionary frontline work, and the legions were held in reserve. How dare he? And the idea that it's only hoplites fighting in this battle. It's like, well, there must have been other troops there, but they just don't warrant literary inclusion. Which again, I think comes back to Lindsay's full circle, back to Lindsay's idea of doctrine, that there must have been doctrine of how you fight battles, but there's also traditions of literature, how you write battles, and much of the doctrine gets omitted from the literary accounts, which for the most part, are what we rely on. And archaeology now starts to paint us a different picture, which is very hard to reconcile with the...
Yeah, and the literary people are probably taking their cue from Homer, which is really about the heroics of individuals. It's the sacrifices they're prepared to make for some higher good, or the gods interfere, to tip the life of one over or not. And it's frustrating, isn't it? Deeply frustrating. And I was going to pick up Mark's point about Pugiones, because having worn one in the Erm Street Guard, they can be a bloody nuisance, frankly, because they kind of hang on your belt in a way that the gladius does not. So the gladius is actually on a baldric and is, how can I say, it's free moving to a point, except that one of the straps actually goes underneath the belt. So that holds it secure. But you use leather frogs to hold the Pugio on. So it's sort of slapping against your thigh as you move along, and that can be a nuisance. What you see, I think, when you look at the evolution of the Pugio is some of them are quite pronounced wide leaf shape, but they seem to get narrower and narrower. But they're elaborate. The scabbards are amazingly elaborately decorated, and that also begins to show itself inside the weapon. These are very collectible by Germanic tribes, and I just wonder, we've got a number of them because they've sort of come from places not just in the Roman Empire but outside that, and you don't see that sort of collectability in the East. So I just wonder whether the archaeology is also a bit tripped up by the fact that these don't exist because they didn't get dropped in the soil, to be as crude as that.
We've got a live question. How exciting. Again, from Carlos. Hi, Carlos. Would you say that geography is the main determination for which tactics evolve in a society? I would say no. I would come back to what Mark was saying earlier about keeping up with the Joneses, that in fact, when we look at Greek society and when we look at various different societies, almost counter to the geography of the region, do you find tactics evolve? That the heavy infantry of the phalanx in the hoplite era is counterintuitive to the geography of Greece. The as you were saying before, Mycenaean age Crete and Mycenaean age Greece is the last place you would expect to find chariots. We've all heard the idea that the reason for modern railway gauges being what they are relates to Roman chariots. And it's like, well, actually, we don't associate Rome with chariots in terms of warfare at all. We associate, although if you go back and you look at film, there are Roman chariots in Roman warfare in film, and you're like, where did you get that from? So I think in some cases, it's an expectation of what your warrior class should be doing. And that's between warrior classes, between cultures and cities, but also warrior class individuals. And we've got lots of examples of the Hippaeus or the Equites, who were once cavalry, because that was how you showed that you were a wealthy individual in a society. And in various cultures, it suddenly becomes, well, we'll keep that name, but we're no longer riding horses. We are now better foot soldiers than others, but we are still the Hippaeus, or we are still the Equites.
I would say geography affects tactics sometimes. So, for example, when the Roman legions in the early days of the Republic, say the 4th century, had to deal with their enemies in central Italy, such as the Samnites, and they had to go fight them in the mountainous country of the peninsula. The Roman legion had to be more flexible to deal with the Samnites. So when you look at how the Manipular legion had the articulation at a relatively small unit level, I could definitely see why that would make it superior than trying to deal with the Samnites or other hill peoples with some one big heavy infantry line, such as a phalanx or what have you. And I think that the Manipular legion was successful in a broad range of situations because the Romans were fighting against many other types of people akin to the Samnites in other parts of the Mediterranean. Things change. I think that if you fought in relatively open areas, such as the steppes, then having cavalry heavy tactics made a lot of sense. And I see that would affect your geography. Not always, but I would say certainly.
So I'm going to nudge that to a bit away from Murray's point. And I go back to my Celtiberians, and I've also got to bring in the Pannonians, who are another kind of Iron Age group of people, where, again, you're taking like the Cantabri and Astures, their landscape is the Cantabrian mountain range, right? So they don't have a lot of plains. It's the foothills that they're probably living and fighting in. And they're riding relatively small horses, and they're using the horse as their primary way to gain an advantage over the Romans. In fact, when the Romans come to that part of the Iberian Peninsula, it's very significant to me that it's taken like 180 years to conquer all the Iberian Peninsula except that bit. And it takes a campaign under Augustus in, I think it's 26 through to about 21, something like that. And then finally with Agrippa in 19 to finally deal with it. And what I think gives them an advantage is that they're using their cavalry and their landscape very effectively. Similarly, when Tiberius and Germanicus are out in 6 through 9 AD in Pannonia, which is very hilly. If you look at Croatia and you go into Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then you go into the hinterlands there with the Western Balkans, again, you're dealing with mountains, and the local people use that very effectively against an enemy which is trained to fight big set piece battles on a big open ground. And of course, we then get into the Armenians and these type of people who use exactly that. They know to avoid those people in those situations and to use the forests and the swamps and whatever else might be. So I think that Mark's point was it's dependent on your geography to some extent. I totally agree with that.
Dacians as well. Look, Tapai is, getting into the heartland of Dacia, which is a plain, but very mountainous until you get there. And the problem, of course, is getting through there involves ravines that you can be ambushed in, and that's how the Dacians have evolved their tactics to ambush anyone trying to get in.
Well, what's very interesting about taking that idea is that when with the piece, I think it's Cassiodeo Velius Paterculus, where he talks about how the Romans are floundering around in the Western Balkans, and in the end they say, we just have to break the army up into small tactical units. And we're going to go out and we're going to go and fight these people where they are. And I don't know whether that's effective, but I think it's very interesting to see reflected in the literature. The traditional tactical way, which is field the cohorts in their Achaeas, triptychs Achaeas, is not going to work. You probably have to break it down to a cohort and just send it and then break it out that way. So what I think that gives you is the idea that you have a set playbook, if you will, and you try and make that work, but you know that when rubber hits road, it's going to need some adjustments on the periphery, isn't it? Because
when hobnail hits stone, yes.
It's exactly the same thing in terms of Alexander when he goes up into Sogdiana and he splits the army up into 5, operational units, because again, it's a combination of geography and also, cultural differences up there in terms of how and what sort of tactics are used, and he has to adapt. So,
but the interesting thing is that the taxace of the phalanx can be split, and then within each taxace you've got 6 syntagmata that can be used.
But in terms of
mini
strategy, you end up at that point you sort of see the different. There's this suggestion that the taxis are not using necessarily the sarissa and the type of equipment that they have before, that they've actually adapted their entire way of fighting.
Sarissa.
So,
yeah. Back to the Dory almost in that sense. Because we've got another live question. We're having a live conversation with Carlos. So would material wealth instead determine how a society arms its warriors and why and what tactics they use? Or is the answer more nuanced and a mix of everything? I think you've answered it yourself in the last sentence there. I think it is a mix of everything, because it's got geography does play a part. Oh, that's what I was going to make the point about. The steppe horse. When we think of the steppes, we think of Arabian stallions galloping across the steppes. No, they're hardy, short, little horses that can go forever. But they are not your thoroughbred stallion that we think of when we think of cavalry. They're not your Clydesdales or your knights' horses, destriers and things like that when we think of medieval warfare. They're a hardy, small horse that just goes and goes and goes and goes. And I think the interesting thing there, of course, is that those tactics have taken them from very, very far in the east, in probably Western China, Mongolia, and they've brought them all the way to the Danube and into the Roman Empire. And those tactics, Hungary today is named after the great Hungarian plain, named after the Huns. That is tactical, landscape named after a people whose tactics evolved because of that geography. But when they get to the Roman Empire, they're now in a region of the world where those tactics don't really work, but they're so vast, there's such a horde of them that it's very hard for the Roman armies to cope with them. But they do eventually, and again, it's about breaking them up in piecemeal. Well, in the Huns sense, it's let them fight amongst themselves and they'll destroy each other, and they do. Once Attila is dead, the Huns, his 3 sons, destroyed the empire themselves. So just wait. Anyway, fabulous. We could probably talk for days about the evolution of tactics. We'll probably revisit this topic, I imagine. Happy 4th of July, everybody. Now, of course, when 4th of July is mentioned, I think about the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, because that was fought on the 4th of July, or the Battle of Hattin in 1187 AD, because that was fought on the 4th of July. So, it's an anniversary you share with several other cultures. All right, lovely. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again on another Ancient Warfare podcast.